All right. So hi, everyone, and welcome to the Fourth Solution Series event. Today, we're discussing lead poisoning and mold. So my name is Callie Sharp. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a law student with the Interdisciplinary Environmental Clinic at WashU Law. The city of St. Louis first began prioritizing the fight against childhood lead poisoning in the early 70s. But despite various programs and funding commitments, this preventable problem continues to devastate children, particularly those in Black communities in the city. Let's take a look at some of the most common sources of lead exposure. Lead exposure occurs when someone inhales or ingests lead particles. The most common source in St. Louis and the easiest one to fix is lead-based paint. So when lead-based paint chips, those chips or dust can be easily ingested or inhaled, especially by children. And small children are likely to eat lead paint chips because they have somewhat of a sweet flavor. Lead can also enter drinking water when plumbing materials that contain lead corrode, especially where the water has high acidity or low mineral content. And some St. Louis public schools have had lead problems in the past with their water systems, and Madeline Middlebrooks, an attorney here today with the Great Rivers Environmental Law Center, is going to discuss some of her work on this later tonight. Deposits from years of leaded gasoline use and industrial sources may also contaminate soil. Children can be exposed to lead in soil by touching, breathing, or playing in lead-contaminated soil, and these particles can also be brought inside the home on shoes or clothing or even on pets. And finally is demolitions. So in our event discussing vacancy a couple weeks ago, we shared the exorbitant amount of vacant and dilapidated houses in St. Louis that are often subject to demolition. When houses with lead paint are demolished, workers have to take very strict precautions to limit the amount of lead dust that's released into the air, because this released lead dust can affect both workers and nearby community members that may breathe it in. So let's take a look at some of the effects of lead exposure. Some of the most common direct effects include permanent brain, nervous system, and organ damage, learning disabilities, behavioral and emotional issues, and aggression. And many of these direct effects can lead to indirect effects that have all been connected with lead poisoning. These can include increased school dropout rates, increased school suspension rates, delinquency, criminal activity, and violence. We have a significant lead poisoning problem in St. Louis. Children living in areas with high numbers of homes built before 1980 are more likely to have elevated blood lead levels because lead-based paints were not outlawed until 1978. And what's concerning is that approximately 90% of the city's homes were built before 1980. So because of this, St. Louis children are twice as likely to have lead poisoning as children statewide. Let's take a look at this map prepared by the city's Department of Health. So here, the darker the shade of blue or green, the higher the percentage of houses in that area were built before 1980. And the larger the red circles, the greater the rate of elevated blood lead levels in that community. As you can see, the largest red circles are often in places that have a large percentage of homes built before 1980. However, there are some high blood lead level rates in some areas with lower percentages of pre-1980 homes, and conversely, there are some low blood lead level rates in some areas with very high percentages of pre-1980 homes. So that tells us that blood lead level rates are based on more factors than just housing age. There is, in fact, a connection between poverty, race, and space when it comes to many environmental issues, and particularly lead poisoning. The wards with the highest childhood lead poisoning rates typically have high rates of residents living below the federal poverty level. In this map on the right, the darker the shade of blue, the higher the elevated blood lead rates in that community. And the larger the black circle, the higher the percentage of community members live in poverty in that area. So here, the largest rates of poverty are most often corresponding with the highest rates of elevated blood lead levels. Most alarming is the disproportionate impact of lead poisoning on Black children in St. Louis. So Black children in St. Louis are 2.4 times more likely than white children to test positive for lead in their blood. And Black children accounted for over 70% of children suffering from lead poisoning in 2016. So if you take a look at the second map here, the darker the shade of red, the higher the child lead poisoning rates, and communities with a black speckled overlay represent majority Black wards. And as you can see, 4 of the 5 wards with the highest childhood lead poisoning rates in 2017 were majority Black wards. Now, there is no safe level of lead exposure. So even though it should be the responsibility of landlords and the government to solve many of the city's problems, I wanted to take a moment to help you identify potential lead hazards in your homes and to give you some tips to help protect yourself and your families in the short term. So as I said before, lead-based paint was outlawed in 1978. So if your home was built around that time or earlier, it may contain lead paint. And you can tell the difference between peeling latex paint and chipping lead paint by looking at these 2 pictures here. So on the left is peeling latex paint, and as you can see, the peels that come off don't really have a strict shape. They're kind of thin and they're just these long peels. And you can tell the difference between peeling latex paint, which contains no lead, and chipping lead paint on the right, which comes off in these kind of thicker chips that are often kind of squared or rectangular shaped, and a lot of times will look chalky or dusty. So if you think that you might have lead paint in your home and you don't have the ability to have it sanded down and removed, or you're having trouble getting your landlord to fix the problem, there are some Band-Aid solutions that you can put on the problem to decrease exposure in the short term. These can be things like covering up chipping lead paint with something like a poster, or trying to monitor where your kids play in your home to make sure that they're not playing near chipping lead paint on your walls or putting it in their mouths. You may also have some concerns about lead in the water in your home. It can be kind of difficult to tell if you have lead in your water, as oftentimes your water won't look, taste, or smell any different if it's contaminated. But if you're concerned about it, you can be sure to flush your water out of the tap for a couple of minutes before using it for consumption to avoid using stagnant water, which is more likely to have lead in it. Now, these fixes are not perfect and they're not ideal, but they can help to reduce your risk of exposure until the problems are more effectively addressed. And finally, I wanted to take a look at some of the connections between lead poisoning and COVID-19. So lead poisoning is associated with some conditions that may make people more susceptible to severe COVID-19 complications. For example, some studies have associated lead poisoning with organ damage and cardiac issues. People are also spending more and more time at home because of social distancing, the shift of school and work to remote settings, lost jobs, and the cancellation of events and activities. And this increased time spent at home increases exposure to problems like lead and mold inside of your home. Additionally, across the country, landlord and government capabilities to perform ongoing lead hazard inspections, controls, and abatement have been decreased because of the pandemic. This can be further exacerbated in situations where landlords aren't receiving rent money and can't evict due to the moratorium on evictions, so thus some of them are refusing or unable to make the necessary repairs. There have also been shortages in PPE, or personal protective equipment, that is necessary to do these lead hazard repairs, so that may be leading to further delays in these types of repairs. And many tenants and homeowners are starting to resort to making interim repairs on their own without proper safe work practices and lead dust testing. There's also been a sharp decrease in pediatric doctor's visits during the pandemic, which results in a decrease in blood lead testing measures. And finally, childhood lead poisoning can cause intellectual and developmental disabilities, and the global pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on those with these disabilities. So many with these types of disabilities require in-home care, social interaction, and various therapies that are limited by the constraints of the pandemic and social distancing guidelines. Shifts to things like telehealth and online education that many of us have been experiencing are often inequitable for many in the disability community. So thank you, and I'm finished discussing lead. I will pass it over to Zach to continue the conversation about mold.